Oh, Marvel fans, doesn't that just get you going there? Love that open. Here's the thing, though. We have a spoiler alert for this next conversation. If you have not seen the latest episode of Falcon and Winter Soldier, record this conversation we're about to have, go watch that episode, and then come back and tune into today's chat. Now, if you have already seen it, let's chat about it now. It was hinted in episode 1 and then made clear in episode 2. Marvel's newest TV series is taking on racism, and fans are taking notice. Take a listen.
In the first episode, we see Sam, aka the Falcon, dealing with this huge responsibility of carrying on the legacy of Captain America. He's conflicted because how can he, a black man, be a symbol of America, a country that has never stood up for him? The second episode pushes this conflict even further by introducing Isaiah Bradley, another super soldier like Captain America. The only difference, the color of his skin. Where we see Captain America loved, adored, honored, and championed, we see Isaiah Bradley thrown in prison, experimented on, tortured, and left with no legacy. With that being said, I'm super excited to see how Marvel uses Isaiah's history to make Sam an even greater hero.
And like many fans, Michael was inspired to go purchase the comic featuring Isaiah Bradley, a character not really known by many until now. I'll admit I had to do plenty of research myself. We want to go deeper on this discussion with the CEO of BlurredCon, Hilton George. Hilton, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, first, your thoughts on Michael's reaction here to this episode and these episodes.
I think it was a lot of our reaction. You got to think, this was an era where, in the first Captain America, they pretty much glossed over the issue of race and segregation within the military during wartime. And even during, peacetime when they were in the America shots. This is a turn for Disney, ostensibly Marvel, to take, on these issues of race and kind of filling in some of the history where Black people and Black characters existed and are now being elevated to the mainstream.
And in regards to the Isaiah Bradley character, it's one with a very dark past. When I was doing my own research, I was shocked by seeing, parts of this comic strip, the issues that they're addressing or the parts of the storyline they go into. Now, in fact, the experimentation that he endured, that has been compared to that of the Tuskegee syphilis study. So talk to us a little more about this character and why you think Marvel chose to introduce him now.
I think now is the time. I think we're in a different era today than we were 15 or 11 years ago when the MCU kind of got its start. And they have found it to be a profitable business model. If you look at what has happened between Black Panther, Luke Cage, the introduction of a Black Nick Fury, to the big screen, all of these things have added an additional dimension, and the representation has been good for the franchise. But I also think it's a good moral decision because they're telling stories that mirror, just as you said, the Tuskegee experiments, where people were being experimented upon without their knowledge and without their consent by the government, and then not treated after the fact or treated poorly. This also goes back to the way that Black people were treated after World War II and after the Korean War, coming back to the Jim Crow South, coming back to segregated America in uniform, thinking that their experience overseas and their fighting for their country would give them, more rights and give them more of that love of the country coming back to them that they gave in war. And we often saw people going to jail, people being lynched, all of those sorts of things. So it is a direct parallel between what we know is the history of this country in wartime and in peacetime, now being reflected in the comics. So this is a character who, one, did not consent to be experimented upon to get the powers. This was something that was done to him. He lost a lot of his platoon, a lot of his battalion to these experiments. He has every reason to be bitter and do everything he did in the episode of being just angry and not wanting to embrace anything going on with today's government in wartime.
And to me, it seems like a really good jumping off point because I know kids like to watch this show just as much as we do as adults. And you want to bring them in on this, but maybe these are extreme topics. So to me, it seems like these topics are good jumping off points, something that they love, that maybe you can have these conversations with your kids about, okay, look, this does have a parallel to our history. While this is make-believe, here's what happened in real life in America. What do you think about having those conversations?
It does make it easier to introduce them because the concept that this country has not always made the right decisions and has always not always done the right thing by a large chunk of its population is something that needs to be introduced. It needs to be discussed because education in America is a patchwork. You know, history books in one state may be different from one in another. So having this discussion in a mass media format is a great way to introduce the concept. And I think that what people are going to do is find it more easily digestible because it's in this fantasy format, you know, that is paralleled with the real world. And I think that what's going to happen is that you're going to see more and more of this, not just in Disney, not just in Marvel, but in sci-fi, in fantasy, in comic book, animated movies, where they are taking on issues of race and injustice and discrimination because of this.
Yeah, and Hilton, the last thing I want to touch on real quick before we run out of time here is this series so far has also showcased profiling by police, even the difficulties, in Black Americans securing financial loans, a lot of things here. What do you say to those people that say to you, like, look, this is the movies, this is make-believe, this is comic. We don't need to have this in that world, in the TV that we watch. Same thing, kind of that same argument with sports, like play the game, you don't need to bring, protests to it. What do you say to people that are going to push back on Marvel addressing these issues?
Well, the best fantasy, the best, fiction reflects fact. We resonate with these stories because we can connect with the characters and we connect with the world that they're in. And as a basic mathematical equation, there are people who feel as if that the escapism should be to the extreme and take us away from the things that may be bad or negative. But I would say it actually brings us closer together to have these discussions, even within the concept of our fantasy worlds, like watching a Marvel movie or reading a comic book. I think these are the things that bind us together. They're hard, they're not easy to discuss, but I guarantee you all of us are going to be better for having had the discussion. And it's going to make it more enjoyable for us to enjoy our fantasy fun together as nerds and geeks watching movies and TV shows in costume.
All together. Well, I enjoyed this conversation with you thoroughly. Thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thanks for having me.